Thank you so much. Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming and joining me. It is a real joy and an honour to be here. And when I enrolled in Paramedicine just down the road in Melbourne, I had never heard of guidelines, and I had no idea that they would become a foundational part of my working life. Now, for the first year of undergraduate study, I was, like I suspect many others are, given a list of guidelines to memorise for my OSCEs. Now, my ability to recite the pages of this all-important book would determine if I progressed or if I lost both 6 months of my life and had to hand another few grand over to the university, both of which are very convincing real-world consequences. See, the idea of guidelines as this sole source of truth was embedded in me really early. Now, when I went on placement a few months later, that was reinforced. I was asked several times to recite the guidelines from memory. I vividly remember making a mistake when I was asked to recite the analgesia guidelines. I confused micrograms with milligrams. Now, you might think that's not such a big deal for someone who'd only ever learned those words for the first time a few weeks ago. Well, the paramedics who were mentoring me were so upset that they went to their supervisor and asked that a formal complaint be put in about me to the university, based purely off that one mistake. After the supervisor refused to do that, my paramedics instead pulled me aside and told me very clearly that I was a bad paramedic and that I should consider quitting. The lesson was the same. Guidelines are all important. In the second year of university, one of my tutors was a critical care paramedic. They call them MICA, Mobile Intensive Care Ambulance Paramedics, down there. This was someone I naturally looked up to, a leader in our profession. I approached them during a tutorial and asked why it was that for a cerebrally irritated TBI patient, Ambulance Victoria contraindicated midazolam and gave opioids, while the Queensland Ambulance Service, a bit further up north, did the exact opposite. His response was that quote on the screen. "Don't talk to me about what Queensland are doing. They're killing their patients." He then just walked off. I was pretty taken aback by this, partly because it didn't answer the question at all. But the bigger thing that struck me was the total lack of curiosity. Disagreement is good and healthy and necessary. But in doing that, he shut down all discussion and refused to even consider if there was a valid reason for those CPG variations. As fate would have it, a few years ago, I met a girl from Maleny, a beautiful spot on the Sunshine Coast hinterland in Queensland. And long story short, I moved to Queensland and I now work for the Queensland Ambulance Service. I was surprised to discover that not only are they not killing their patients, they're actually doing a bloody good job up there. Now, when I moved into state, I met a paramedic who works for 2 different ambulance services. Depending on what day of the week it is, she'll be working either side of a state line. Now, she once attended the same chronic patient with different services, and she was forced to give completely different treatments for the exact same presentation a few days apart. The patient, understandably, was baffled. Another Victorian who moved to Queensland around the same time I did accidentally gave a patient the Ambulance Victoria maximum dose of intranasal fentanyl, 400 micrograms, rather than the more conservative Queensland Ambulance Service maximum of 200 micrograms. They were accused of overdosing their patient and had to go through a formal investigation. Now, hearing these stories ignited my curiosity. Why are there so many differences? Do any of these differences actually matter? And why is it that a $5 billion industry, massive, well-funded, doesn't agree on basic medical care? I started asking around, and it turned out a lot of other people were curious too. So we formed a team of nearly 40 paramedics, doctors, and nurses, and we decided to list out the main differences. Now, we gathered the data directly from the guidelines of each service, and then we double-checked it with people who work for that service. And when we did this, we relied on the publicly available guidelines. Some services still keep some CPGs secret, such as for community paramedics or aeromedical teams or where a clinical trial was ongoing. They told us they were confidential and they wouldn't give us a copy. So this isn't a comprehensive or a perfect set of work. It's a rough and ready starting point that aims to raise awareness and get us all thinking. Now, our first idea was to publish formal, peer-reviewed comparisons, and we agreed with the Australasian Journal of Paramedicine, as it then was, to do a regular series. And we actually did publish our first 3 papers. However, bad luck struck. AJP was then shut down for a couple of years while it leveled up into Paramedicine, the new international journal. Now, that's great news for the journal and great news for paramedics, but it did leave us without a home. Now, we also realised at this point that the topic doesn't really need formal peer review. It just needs to be fun and interesting. So, we started putting them together instead as posters. And they found a new home at a place called the Shift Extension. Now, the Shift Extension is a paramedic magazine. They love the posters, and they renamed the whole thing the Clinical Guideline Manifesto, which I love because it's so dramatic. I don't actually know what a manifesto is. Now, here's what they look like. I'm going to use nausea and emesis as an example. You're not going to be able to see all the detail here. That doesn't matter. It's just to get a feel for what we did. So first, we just put a title up there. Then we put a legend. Green is your everyday paramedic. Blue is critical care or intensive care or mobile intensive care ambulance paramedics. Yellow is community paramedics or extended care paramedics. And red is any other specialist role, which normally refers to HEMS. On the left-hand side, we have the 10 jurisdictional services in Australia and New Zealand. The top row is all the treatments. So we've got ondansetron, administered via 3 different possible routes. There's prochlorperazine, metoclopramide via a couple of different routes, droperidol, levomepromazine, which is obviously new to me, and dexamethasone. Now, I actually added gastric aspiration at the end of this. I will be the first to admit that doesn't really make sense, but I wanted to include it in one of the posters, and this one overall seemed like the best fit. Emesis, regurgitation, you get the train of thought. Now, we split all those treatments into 2 types. There's pharmacology, so the medications you give, and then interventions, which we refer to physical things that you do. So then you just have to round out the table and you're good to go. So for regular paramedics, at the time that we made it, here is who does what. You can see that everyone has IM ondansetron, while only St John Northern Territory used dexamethasone for nausea. Now, we only included if something is offered or not. So the more complex details, like the dosages or the contraindications, there were massive and fascinating differences. But cataloguing it all just proved too time-consuming for our volunteers, and it was too hard to present in these simple posters. So then we add in the critical care interventions. Then there's the community paramedic interventions. So that drug I didn't know is carried by community paramedics in New Zealand at the moment. If anyone out there is a community paramedic in New Zealand, I would love to learn about this drug later. And finally, we included other specialist roles. Now, we also added in some footnotes. This was just really to explain things a little bit better, like if a drug is carried by that service but not indicated for that particular condition, so they've got it but they're not using it. Or for some of the posters, but not all, I created a little flowchart of the pathology. Now, this was really just some revision for me personally, so take them all with a grain of salt. Finally, we added in 1 or 2 sentences on the mechanism of action of the interventions. So ondansetron is mostly serotonin, prochlorperazine is mostly dopamine, etc., etc. And at the very end, we briefly summarised our methods, in case anyone's curious. And then down in the bottom, we put what all the different acronyms stand for and who did the poster, and some contact details. All right, that is the basic format of the posters. Now, over the course of a couple of years, we did 33 of these, and you can look up any one of the 33 we've made for a quick overview of who does what. I have 3 examples for you. Here is medical cardiac arrest. Did you know that one service in Australia and New Zealand does stack shocks? That's 3 shocks immediately in a row. Another 2 do dual defibrillation. That's 2 different defibs, so 4 sets of pads. And that 3 services do the good old precordial thump. It's a massive whack to the sternum with a closed fist. It seems like that'd be really cathartic. Here is another one. This is the traumatic cardiac arrest poster. 3 services do ultrasound mid-arrest. 1 service does external aortic compression. 5 have doctors who can do full thoracotomies. And no one fancies Reboa at the moment. And very last example, here is cerebrovascular accidents. 13 different tools are used to assess and triage strokes. Lysis referral timeframes range from 4 hours to 24 hours. 5 guidelines say to correct hypoglycemia, 5 don't mention it. 4 say to give an antiemetic, 6 say to give analgesia. The differences just keep on keeping on. Now, it's really strange to think that you would be treated completely differently in Albury to a few hundred metres south in Wodonga, or on the north side of Dixon Street in Coolangatta, to the south in Tweed Heads. But that's exactly the case. Some of the paramedics I spoke to referred to this phenomenon as postcode lottery. Which ambulance service responds to you, and consequently, which set of guidelines you fall under, will probably be the single most important factor in deciding your out-of-hospital treatment, and in turn, that part of your health outcomes. Here are the 33 topics. I am very grateful to say that these posters have been wildly popular. They've racked up over 10,000 downloads from people in over 110 countries, and I get an almost constant stream of emails asking about them. And what this shows to me is that, unlike my mate from before, many paramedics don't just want to memorise a book. They want to know why. They want to know what the options are, and they want to constantly challenge themselves, their service and their guidelines to be better. However, there's a few points to remember. Now, the first is that these services change their guidelines constantly. Now, that's fantastic. That is exactly what we want to see in good evidence-informed medicine. But it does mean that these posters will go out of date. Some of them will be out of date already. And we haven't got the resources to continually update them as volunteers. So they're really just a snapshot in time. Secondly, there is almost always no objective right or wrong. Now, I'll discuss this a bit more in a moment, but the evidence in out-of-hospital care is often ambivalent, if it exists at all. The most popular treatment isn't the best. Just because all 10 services are doing the same thing doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And if only one service is doing it, doesn't mean it's wrong. For the record, there are definitely very popular treatments we absolutely should not be doing, which, again, we'll chat about a bit more. And the guidelines probably shouldn't be identical anyway, because we don't treat an identical population, which I'll also talk about later on. And finally, we can all always improve. That is just the nature of medicine. Now, for the rest of the speech, I've created a rotating list of some of the differences. So if you get bored of listening to me, you can just have a peruse of these. If I've set it up correctly in the PowerPoint, they should swap every 20 seconds. That QR code in the top right corner will take you to the actual published article in the National Library. And at the end of that is a dot point list of some of the interesting differences. So why would 40 people spend a year of their life doing this in their spare time? Because guidelines matter. Clinical practice guidelines have an incredibly profound and constant presence that weaves its way through our profession. Here are 4 examples that I've already hinted at. Firstly, education. For the nearly 8,000 current paramedic university students in Australia, memorising your local CPGs is often a rite of passage, and OSCEs and other assessments often use the community's local service CPGs as the right answer. Secondly, discipline. In several of the old school ambulance services, going outside the guidelines is grounds for an automatic investigation. Some services actually have a presumption of guilt on any variation from the CPGs that the paramedic is then given the onus of disproving. Now, expecting a clinician to be able to rationalise their treatment is completely reasonable. However, the method in which this is implemented can have big impacts on the incentivisation. Fear of an investigation creates a strong disincentive to vary your treatment, even if that is what the patient in front of you truly needs. And in turn, that encourages paramedics to practice bad medicine that over-relies on guidelines. Thirdly, legal. Guidelines are used in court when things inevitably go wrong. And they've even made their way all the way to the High Court of Australia, who ruled that they are not to be blindly applied like protocols are. And finally, most importantly, culture. Less so today, but historically, many paramedics were taught to treat their local guidelines as the source of truth. They're irrefutable, they're perfect, with what one researcher's doctoral thesis described as a punitive culture that enforces following the rules. Now, this mentality, where any variation from your own guidelines is looked on with suspicion rather than curiosity, still persists in some quarters. So, guidelines clearly matter. Now, having guidelines be so prevalent in our profession is not totally a bad thing, but it can be problematic. The biggest problem is that medicine is just not suited to guidelines. The president of the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine, the National College for Emergency Medicine here, recently said to me, paramedics and doctors' jobs is knowing how to break the guidelines safely, because the guidelines apply to a very, very narrow group of people. So we have these guidelines that we've made the bedrock of our profession, and the top emergency doctor in the country is saying that they just aren't that useful. Why is this? Well, it's because writing a single set of guidelines to cover the almost infinite situations that paramedics go to is impossible. There's always a regression to the mean. And most of healthcare is in reality a balancing of probabilities. You can rarely be certain of the exact treatment that will work for your patient. Multiple treatments are often equally reasonable, and all treatments carry risks that need to be weighed. Because of this, our guidelines are often written for a hypothetical average patient who doesn't actually exist. There's another massive limitation to many of our guidelines, one which is the dark secret of out-of-hospital medicine. There is little definitive empiric research. Take these brief examples from 3 of the more topical interventions that we're all talking about at the moment. Rapid sequence induction during TBI. Now, the evidence for this is mixed. Done really well, it probably has a minor benefit. Done incorrectly, and it is almost certainly harmful. To achieve that really well standard consistently requires an enormous amount of ongoing time, effort, and other resources from the services. So should services invest time and money in electing to pursue a treatment that is maybe beneficial? A second example, out-of-hospital extracorporeal coronary pulmonary resuscitation, eCPR, or the addition of ECMO during CPR. Now, it might improve outcomes, but it is both enormously expensive, and the existing studies, there's 4 data sets currently, they all have major risks of bias. So how do you weigh this against other possible treatments? A third example, mechanical external chest compression devices, which one ambulance service recently installed on every single ambulance at a cost of roughly $13 million. There is no difference in neurologically intact 30-day survival, and previous research has shown them not to be cost effective. Now, services cannot do everything, and every treatment they do invest in has an opportunity cost of another treatment foregone. Now, that is really hard when those 3 examples I gave are all life and death scenarios. If you could only afford to do one of those 3, which one would you pick? Would you pick RSI for TBI, ECMO during CPR, or mechanical chest compression devices? If you don't know, don't worry. I've read the evidence on them and I'm genuinely not sure. Because of this, our guidelines are most often a best guess by a handful of experts, often informed by really weak evidence, rather than the proven treatments we would like to believe. Unsurprisingly, when there is a lack of empirical evidence, experts disagree. During our research, several guideline writers have mentioned the difficulty of being caught between conflicting expert medical opinions. As a paramedic, when several professors of medicine disagree, which one's advice should you follow? Methods that account for this, such as doing a Delphi or discussing the certainty of evidence in guidelines, just aren't used in guidelines. The evidence itself and the strength of evidence is seldom summarised for paramedics in the CPGs that they use. And what this means is that paramedics really have no choice but to blindly follow the guidelines without knowing the evidentiary basis. So, are we at least comparing the outcomes from our differences with each other to work out what the best treatments are and to build more evidence? Well, not really, no. Running a large randomised trial when you're dealing with life and death is ethically and logistically a mess. Now, of course, having this variation across the country provides a perfect opportunity to run natural experiments. We compare the outcomes across each state to get a pretty unreliable hint about which treatment works best. Now, strangely enough, while this does occasionally happen, it's really rare. Again, there isn't any centralised research institute to take ownership of such a project, and getting ethics, logistics and funding to compare a dozen treatments across the entire country is extraordinarily painful. Now, some of the larger services have extremely well-equipped and talented research units. However, many of the smaller services can't afford this. And in any case, in almost all cases, many paramedic services very reasonably view research as an adjunct to their core business of delivering emergency medical services and responding to 000 or 111 calls. Consequently, research tends to receive secondary consideration. So guideline writers are faced with an incredibly difficult job. They are writing the documents that determine the medicine that millions of people receive, more than 4 or 5 million last year, I think. They have wider effects on education, discipline, law, and culture. They are trying to create a single guideline to summarise how to treat infinite variable situations. And they have very little evidence to use. Given these pretty major difficulties, you'd probably assume that all the services have come together and pooled their resources to access the economies of scale and increase their efficiency. Now this is, for better and for worse, not the case. So, why don't we write CPGs together in Australia? There are at least 5 major disincentives. Now firstly, doing so would require every service losing control of a critical part of their job. Now, given that the services have a legal duty of care to their patients, handing over partial control of what treatments they provide to an independent body is a pretty anxiety-inducing proposition for most managers. Secondly, achieving any kind of consistency would require a lot of change from the majority of us. This isn't easy. Changing what drug you carry doesn't just mean buying something different from the store. You have to roll out an education program to thousands of paramedics, ship drugs across the country, find a place for it in our often overflowing bags, and sometimes you even have to get legislation changed to make it legal. Thirdly, and probably most importantly, it literally isn't their job. The mandate of the services is to provide care for their jurisdiction, not the whole country. It isn't the job of the richer services to help out the poorer services by funding them to write good guidelines. In fact, although I certainly hope no one would, it is possible that people would argue that spending your state's money on another state's population will of course come at a detriment to your own population and therefore constitutes mismanagement. Hopefully, we are all a bit more altruistic than that. Fourthly, there is no liability for producing substandard guidelines. Now, while individual paramedics can be subject to discipline by employers, deregulation by AHPRA, or even criminal charges for failing to practice appropriately. And they are regularly. None of those things apply in daily practice realistically to the services themselves. They can, if they choose, ignore their guidelines without any real threat of consequences, certainly none personally for the people writing them. And fifthly, they have a monopoly. Consumers cannot choose to go elsewhere. That means there's no competition and consequently no existential threat of going out of business if someone else offers better treatments. So for those 5 reasons, it's not that surprising that we don't collaborate on guidelines. And it isn't all doom and gloom. There are some benefits to this variation. I'm going to list out 6. So firstly, innovation is a little bit easier when there's some variation around the country, perhaps helped out slightly by some friendly competition. The services are constantly trying new things out. Remember, different isn't always wrong. Now secondly, Australia is big and different places need different treatments. The rheumatic heart disease epidemic and the massive travel times of the Northern Territory and the urban population of inner Sydney are completely different beasts, and a one-size-fits-all approach will never be appropriate. So we need local variations. Thirdly, paramedic services generally aim to integrate with their local hospital system. So therefore, if your local hospital or an entire health department has already chosen a particular medication or a particular preparation of the medication as their preference, it often makes sense for the services to adopt the same medication, the same preparation, for continuity of care and to reduce errors at that transition of care into the hospital. Now fourthly, each service falls under completely different laws and regulations. Fifthly, path dependence means that if a service already has a particular service or a technology established, it might be more efficient to choose new treatments that match nicely with those, rather than rebuilding the whole system from scratch. So, for example, New Zealand has extended care paramedics who carry roughly 30 extra medications. Adding 1 extra drug onto them probably isn't that hard. However, in Victoria, we don't have community paramedics at all yet. And instead of adding 31 new drugs onto everyone, it might make a lot more sense to invest instead in secondary telephone triage. And in fact, that is exactly what's happened. Sixth, local guidelines recognise that budgets vary greatly across the services. Now, while Tasmania comes in first with a generous $267 per person, Western Australia struggles to keep up with a bit above half that at $155 a person. And those figures get really out of whack when you consider population size and economies of scale. Our services in Australia have budgets that range from $1.6 billion to under 4% of that at $50 million. Now, some of our medications are very expensive. A life-saving tenecteplase, for example, comes in at just under $2,000 a dose, multiplied by thousands of ambulances and replaced regularly after shelf expiry. Some services genuinely cannot afford to do what others can. So, those are the 6 big benefits to local variation. However, there are, of course, problems to this inconsistency. So firstly, while having flexibility is good, having paramedics give totally different treatments for no reason isn't. It exacerbates inequalities in healthcare, especially for the poorer services who can't afford an entire guideline team. And it's confusing for paramedics and for patients alike. Secondly, some guidelines are massively out of date with current medical practice. Now, this isn't a name and shame speech. I'm not going to point them out here. But if you're eagle-eyed, you'll be able to spot them in that article. One of my friends is actually an ED registrar, and when I showed her some of the guidelines, she was absolutely horrified. Now, thirdly, while this variation does provide an opportunity for us to learn from each other, we often just aren't. During our recent interviews with the writers of CPGs in Australia, one person was shocked when I told them what their neighbour state is doing. They literally said, "Oh my God, I didn't even know that was possible." Now, fourthly, above all, our current system is painfully inefficient. With each service producing their own guidelines, we are, very literally, continually writing the same book 9 times over. So rather than just doing the job once and doing it properly, we're doing it 9 times and we're doing it often badly. So that's 4 reasons why it isn't great. Now, these inconsistencies do come in stark contrast to the United Kingdom, where in 2000, dozens of different services, much more than we have, came together to form a single central research body that creates national guidelines. Or to New Zealand, who also have national CPGs produced with private providers. In both of those locations, there are national guidelines that are then also tailored to each region's specific needs. So you're not locked in by them. You can still get all the benefits of local variation without the burden of writing from scratch. Now, at this point, some of you are probably wondering, how are guidelines actually made? Well, in short, it varies a lot. I'm not going to bore you to death by explaining the agreed to instrument, or the grade methodology, or the NHMRC guidelines for guidelines, but I will list out what I see as the major common problems with how we make guidelines currently. Firstly, not enough people. Now, some places have full teams, but that's unfortunately pretty rare. Most places have less than 1 full-time equivalent person doing it. One service I spoke to had over 500 guidelines and 1 person to revise them. Another service was recently overdue to revise all of their guidelines by 6 years. Secondly, there's methods that risk error. I actually asked one former guideline writer how they came up with their guidelines, and they frankly told me that they just make them up, sometimes with a quick Google search. Now, that person is a highly trained doctor, a professor of medicine, actually. So their version of just make it up is probably correct. But there is still a risk of error or of bias, or of that one individual not keeping up with the mountains of new evidence that we hope would inform our practice. It is not a good system. And it's definitely not what I would expect from billions of dollars of investment. Now, since we started this series of posters, we've actually been contacted multiple times by actual CPG writing teams who have asked us to produce posters on a particular topic so that they can quickly review what everyone else is doing while updating their own guidelines. Now, we were happy to do that and we said yes in every single case. However, surely our emergency healthcare system shouldn't rely on unpaid volunteers making informal posters. Thirdly is the use of volunteers. Now, many services call on paramedics to give up their free time and rewrite a guideline. They call it a development opportunity. Sometimes they make it compulsory as part of an intensive care internship. Now, the problem with that is that you're at the mercy of the skills of whoever volunteers. We really need specialists doing these roles. Fourthly, similar to that, both the volunteers and whoever is paid staff on the team rarely has any training in evidence synthesis or in guideline development. These are not simple things. I'm sure you've heard of Cochrane or the Campbell Collaboration or the Joanna Briggs Institute. There are entire global teams who spend their whole careers looking at evidence synthesis. To pick a random paramedic off the road and ask them to do the same thing in their spare time is not fair to our patients. Fifthly, there's no access to evidence. Almost all the ambulance services have no subscription to academic databases. How do they get articles? In some places, by picking volunteers who happen to be doing a master's in intensive care, who can then use their university subscription. This is wild to me. The government is kind of stealing services from the universities. Now, I don't really blame them, I don't really care. Paramedics are above all practical, and we do tend to believe that the end justifies the mean. But that is, again, not a good system, and probably not a legal one. All 5 of those problems, understaffing, poor methods, volunteerism, lack of training, and lack of access to data, can all be fixed by proper resourcing. Now, I want to mention funding here. I'm doing my doctorate in medical economics after all. For frame of reference, in Australia alone, the budget of the 8 jurisdictional services was $5.4 billion last year. They are, as one of the managers frankly told me, big businesses. Currently, having spoken to the CPG writer groups in Australia, I've assessed that the percentage of annual budgets that most services, again, not all, but most, allocate to CPG writing is under 0.001% of their annual budget. Literally 1,000th of a single percent for some services. What does that mean? It means that right now, deciding the treatment we give is an afterthought. It is amazing to me that we've built an incredible system of highly trained, university-educated paramedics, provided them with state-of-the-art equipment and medications, built this entire system that achieves incredible response times across one of the biggest countries on the planet. We spend years studying soft skills like Daniel Kahneman's systems or crew resource management, and yet, underneath it all, deciding the actual treatment we provide, arguably the single most important facet of our function, the purpose of the whole system, is an afterthought. For me, it makes the rest of it ring a little bit hollow. Now again, some services have incredible guideline teams and processes, better than I could ever do, but many do not. They cannot afford it. And that's only in the Australasian public services. There is an entire world out there of private providers, and beyond that, of second and third world countries who don't even have the resources of our smaller services. So, we have guidelines that our country's top ED doctor says are not particularly useful. We're all going it alone, sometimes with no idea of what our neighbours are doing. Most places, not all, but most, are writing them without enough resources to do the job properly. And even if they are written perfectly, we don't have enough resources to do every possible intervention, and we have to make life or death decisions about where our money goes. And yet, despite all of that, we still treat them as the benchmark standard that we hold ourselves against. That's the slightly depressing bit. But I want to bring us back to having some fun. What would dream guidelines look like? This is the bit where you can go wild. In my eyes, there will be a national research institute, or better still, a consortium, including consumers, patients, paramedics of all levels, researchers, managers, and a variety of other stakeholders, that both produces living systematic reviews on out-of-hospital evidence-informed medicine, and that also runs continual experiments to determine best treatment. Now from this, a rigorous set of national guidelines could be developed using a Delphi method that each state or territory can then tailor to their local population's need, logistics, and budget. Ideally, that tailoring wouldn't be based on state or territory at all, but on more meaningful factors like how rural a patient is. I suspect, certainly can't prove, that a separate set of urban and rural guidelines that cross borders is more appropriate in Australia than a separate set for each state and territory. How much would all of that cost? My best guess at the moment is several $1 million, which is really just so little compared to the billions that we already spend. How do we fund this? Well, I would start with the Medical Research Future Fund, who routinely gives out up to $10 million a year for 5 years. Or, alternatively, perhaps as a joint collaboration between all the services, the universities, the Australasian College of Medicine, and the Council of Ambulance Authorities. Once we have those guidelines, we can then make them open access and free for the world. Create this high benchmark standard that we let everyone use. Help private providers and countries around the world to also deliver best care. Our guidelines should be our pride. They should be something that we show to the nurses or the doctors and they say, wow, that's incredible, I want those. Culturally, as paramedicine develops further as a profession, guidelines will then be used in their pure sense, to guide, rather than to prescribe or define someone's scope of practice. And they'll be just one consideration for a clinician when treating patients. All right, what do I hope you remember from this presentation? 3 things. 1, don't assume that different is wrong. 2, get involved, advocate for change, and keep pushing your services to be better. CPGs will never be perfect or completed or finished because medicine is constantly changing, and we need to change with it. And 3, think about what other people are doing and why. Don't dismiss it. Be inquisitive, be curious, and be relentless. Thank you.
If you were unable to write guidelines yourself, what would they look like?
So the question was, if you were to write guidelines yourself, what would they look like? Well, firstly, you need strength of evidence. So I'm not aware of a single guidelines that includes a summary of findings table, or that lists that aspirin has a number needed to treat of 42 for occlusion myocardial infarction under the ISIS-2 trial, or that adrenaline in cardiac arrest has no impact on 30-day neurologically intact survival under the Paramedic-2 trial. Those are incredibly important things that have very real impact on my practice. I tell patients that when I give them aspirin. Additionally, when there is no data and something is just a best guess, like the Ambulance Victoria and Queensland Ambulance Service maximum dosages of intranasal fentanyl, 400 micrograms and 200 micrograms respectively, both of which are completely reasonable but also, frankly, somewhat arbitrary, that needs to be explicitly stated. Let our paramedics know what is solid, irrefutable evidence and what is nothing more than a best guess. That'll then empower them to make more informed decisions and to do their jobs better. So that's the first point. The second point I'd make is you need tiered amounts of background information. So on one extreme, you need a quick reference version, something you can skim at 2 a.m. in the morning when you're 5 minutes away from a scene for a job you haven't done in years. Something that just gives you the bare bones. On the other extreme, you also need a version with the full pathophysiology. Because remember, in reality, these are used for education, both by university students and, as some unpublished research that I've been part of that will soon be out shows, by paramedics themselves. Now, without the detailed version, the onus then falls on individual paramedics to research conditions. Sure, that's part of their training, it's part of the conditions of registration, but the reality is that different people have different capacities for research and different times available. Some of my mates very openly simply do not do any research beyond reading the small paragraph at the start of the CPGs. That is reality. We shouldn't be too proud to accept that that is all the research that a large portion of our workforce will ever do. Plus, with around 25,000 registered paramedics, another 8,000 students in Australia alone, we are repeating that time-consuming process many times over. I think it would be far more efficient to have this done centrally to a high standard and have good reference documents that everyone can study from. So I think that'd be the second point. The third thing I'd say is that you need tiered interventions. Guidelines aren't just used by general paramedics. They're used by everyone, from volunteer first responders to consultant physicians. You don't want interventions that are irrelevant to you cluttering up your screen, but you also do need to be able to see what other people's scope of practice is so you know when they can add value, when to call for backup, when to get on the phone and consult someone. Most places, as far as I'm aware, are already doing this, and I really love it. Fourthly, you need to look at graphic design. Yeah. And finally, you need information on production. What information did they look at? What information did they ignore? Why did they decide to value some research more than other? When is the next due date to review the guideline? That's all just basic transparency.
Paramedics using guidelines to study or revise, is that a bad thing?
So the question was, paramedics are using guidelines to study or revise. Is that a bad thing? It's a good question. We do actually have some soon to be published evidence that paramedics already use them exactly that way. It's not bad of itself. The 3 problems I see is that guidelines aren't written with that purpose in mind. and we know that they aren't consistently produced to a high enough standard to support that use. And most importantly, I suspect at the moment, that many paramedics are forced into relying on their guidelines because they don't get feedback on if their diagnosis or treatment were correct. They drop a patient off at the ED and they never hear from them again. This leaves paramedics unable to reflect on and improve their own practice. And that in turn leads to further over-reliance on generic guidelines rather than tailored care. How do you get around that? Feedback on patients. It's critical. We introduced this in Queensland a couple of years ago and it has absolutely revolutionised my practice. Every single shift, I look up every single patient that I previously treated during the last shift. I can see their final diagnosis, all their in-hospital results, their discharge summary, their investigations, their imaging. Now, over the course of hundreds of patients, that has changed completely how I practice because I objectively find out if my diagnosis was right or wrong. So, for an example, previously, I'm certain I wouldn't have been brave enough to say that I thought a chest pain was costochondritis. But after seeing it a dozen times, I was accurately able to pick that a few days ago. That's real revision. Now, my dream is that every day, every single paramedic gets an email a few days after each shift listing what their diagnosis was and what the final discharge diagnosis was. That's how you not only empower but actually force people to reflect and improve. So for now, if you don't have access to ED medical records, getting access in your service, that should be your number one priority. That's more important to practice than guidelines, in my opinion.
What if there is no guideline?
So the question was, what if there is no guideline? In theory, if there is no guideline, that shouldn't be an issue. Remember, you can ignore guidelines, so it doesn't matter if there is one or isn't one. But in practice, many services use scope of practice to limit the treatment to what is in the guidelines. So that includes in my service in Queensland, we have written on every second page of our guidelines that we are only authorised to perform procedures listed within the guidelines. Now what that means is I can't teach myself a new procedure and introduce it into my practice. I'm limited to what's already been picked in the guidelines. And this has actually happened to me. A little while ago, more than a year ago now, I was an hour from hospital with a girl with known benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. She's had it a million times. It always resolves with the epi. I only carry on Dancitron, which is no good for vestibular nausea, because serotonin. So I wanted to do the epi, a simple, safe procedure that I've done many times before. I'm not allowed to. I actually rang up and asked permission, and my boss said, no, that's not in the guidelines. So that poor girl just had to spew for the next hour. There's actually a postscript on that one, which is when we got to the hospital, the nurse did the epi while she was still on the stretcher and she was immediately discharged home by the doctor, and we just turned around and took her back. Now that is a massive waste of resources, thousands and thousands of dollars. So having that clause in my guidelines means they're not true guidelines. I can't do things outside them. They define my scope, so they aren't guidelines. They're more 50-50 guidelines and protocols. Now the benefit to this approach is it is a safety net. The drawback to it is the loss of flexibility. So unless you have a guideline for every single medical condition, which of course there are hundreds, thousands, you can't treat people for conditions outside the guidelines. Now the services themselves also realise this, and they do want a tiny bit of wiggle room for when some genuinely crazy, unpredictable, high-risk event actually happens. So a common approach is to have relatively strict guidelines, but to have two methods to circumvent this. One is looser guidelines, or even no scope of practice, for critical care or community paramedics. The second is to have telephone consultation to go outside the guidelines. Now personally, I really like both of these approaches. They provide a basic safety net while still allowing appropriate variations. In the future, I see guidelines not being used to create a hard limit on scope, and I see no reason why a paramedic can't do an external course in the EPLI move, get that signed off by their employer, and then introduce it into their practice. A few of my friends are ED nurses and they all do this. They get it signed off by the hospital and they're off and away. Now, as far as I'm aware, we don't currently have a mechanism for this in the jurisdictional services. However, last month at the Health Ministers meeting, all of the national ministers for health of every state and territory agreed to support specialist registration for critical care and community paramedicine in Australia. Now, that might be a route to allowing this if the employers choose to recognise it. Remember, your employer can always define your scope of practice. They're allowed to do that.
Can you discuss guidelines versus protocols? What's the difference and what's the future?
So the question was, can you discuss guidelines versus protocols? What's the difference? What's the future? It's a great question. For those of you who don't know, protocols tell you what you must do. If you fail to do that, you have done the wrong thing and you were disciplined. As far as I'm aware, everyone uses protocols for medication dosages, and one service uses protocols for everything and doesn't have guidelines at all. Guidelines, on the other hand, give you a menu of options that you can pick and choose from, and which you can importantly choose to ignore. If you ignore them, you have done nothing wrong. If you're right or wrong, it comes down to a clinical review afterwards, and that clinical review is not a comparison against the guidelines. Now, I've met some paramedics who really dislike being under guidelines. They view it as a restriction. I do not. If they're true guidelines, not protocols, then you can ignore them completely without any consequence, so there is no restriction. I view guidelines as incredibly helpful, and I would not want to work without them, for two reasons. Firstly, I know that I don't have the capacity to stay across all the literature all the time. And secondly, I also know that my memory is fallible, and having something to quickly look at gives me a lot of reassurance. However, this only applies if they actually are guidelines. Now, one manager said, we'll just rename them from protocols to guidelines and that's it. But I really don't think that captures the complexity, the cultural complexity of how people use these. The name doesn't mean anything. The more important thing is how you react when someone does something different. If you require justification for every step outside the guidelines, if that justification is usually a semi-formal or formal investigation, if variations are frowned upon culturally, then you effectively have protocols, regardless of what you call them. If you only investigate when there is a serious risk of adverse outcome or concerns are raised by one party, if the process is informal, brief, constructive, and if the process is tailored in such a way that paramedics aren't fearful or anxious at all, then you have what are 50-50 guideline protocols, my personal preference. And if you don't compare treatment to your document at all, but you do a proper clinical review afterwards, then you have true guidelines.
Can you talk a little bit more about graphic design?
Yeah, the question was, can you talk a bit more about graphic design? It's a huge issue in other industries, and there is an entire field of research looking at disasters from airlines, nuclear reactions, NASA, those high-risk, high-complexity systems where they've found that having to refer to a 30-page manual to find the solution isn't helpful in a disaster. Now, our situation is not quite that extreme. We're genuinely only dealing with one life rather than dozens or millions, and our CPGs are only ever a few pages long. However, the general principle is exactly the same. They need to be usable by human beings, not written as legal documents that are difficult to interpret in a time of crisis. I think it's reasonable to suggest that visual differences will affect both speed of interpretation and accuracy of interpretation. From other fields, not paramedicine, things we know to avoid are just text. Most humans generally, don't interpret a wall of text as rapidly or as accurately as diagrams. So having to refer to multiple pages, or worse, to multiple documents, you don't want people to have to flick back and forth in the heat of the moment. Lots of different confusing shapes or symbols that aren't universal. So making up your own symbols is bad. Use standardized international ones. Thin lines that are hard to see. Colors that meld together, or that are faint, or that aren't friendly to colorblind people. Organisation within categories that are really intuitive. I mean, if you're trying to remember the details of a GTN infusion for an APO patient, you don't want to be trying to remember if your service locates APO under cardiac, respiratory, or medical sections. And there are services in Australia that put it under each of those three sections. Something similar to this actually happened to me last weekend. Dead serious, I went to an amputation. And on the way, I don't know about you, I go to amputations rarely, if ever. I was looking up what to do with the amputated body part, because it's certainly not something I'm particularly familiar with. I kept trying to find it across 3 different documents. I couldn't find it under A. After the job, I finally found it. It was under M for management of amputation. For skills, you want clean, simple diagrams. The best I've seen of these are the Queensland Ambulance Service ones. I know I'm biased, but they have a graphic designer and staff who produces medical illustrations for all the skills. The pictures are fantastic. And this is actually by the by, but when I was a university student in Victoria, I was expected to memorise the Ambulance Victoria guidelines, but all of us would secretly look up the pictures in the Queensland Ambulance Service skills section to learn how to do a skill, because they're just so much more user-friendly. Doesn't make them right or wrong, doesn't make them better or worse overall, but in my opinion, you should let everyone use them, and that kind of simplicity and ease of use is your goal. And most importantly, everything needs to be visible at a single glance, what the astronaut Chris Hadfield would call a one-pager. You need your big overview of the entire medical condition to be visible all at once, and then you need to be able to drill down into the specifics.
What are living systematic reviews?
The question was, what are living systematic reviews? Which you might have heard me mention right at the end is one of the things I would recommend. It's a systematic review that is routinely updated several times a year, either just through the passage of time, like every month, or updated early if relevant literature comes out. And you can easily set up email notifications from all the databases every time a relevant article that matches your search terms is published. These already exist. In Australia, we have ALEC, the Australian Living Evidence Collaboration, and the NCET, the National Clinical Excellence Task Force. Both of those have transparent, clear methods, and they actually do weekly evidence scans. So we don't have to start from scratch here. The whole framework is already set up for us. Now, this kind of thing already exists if you look at the Canadian Pre-Hospital Evidence Repository. If you Google EMS space PEP, ignore the shoddy website look and focus on the content. Now that's basically the first step, collecting and evaluating the evidence. What the PEP is missing is synthesis of evidence using a Delphi and then writing a good open access guideline from it. That's what I would like to see us doing.